Well, good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's, of course, a great honor for me to address this Jubilee conference of the NCDO. Promoting global citizenship is a worthy pursuit, and I think we all have to learn a lot from NCDO's 40 years track record. I've just spent 2 days here in the Netherlands, and it confirmed what I had already experienced in my previous lives with the European Commission, that your country has much to share with the global community through international trade. Just a few weeks ago, the first DHL Global Connectedness Index concluded that the Netherlands has the most economic links with the rest of the world. This detailed and very interesting study analyzes country by country the flows that connect the world, focusing on the depth and the breadth of integration. And on the other end of the spectrum, another recent report confirmed that the Dutch population is the most integrated Twitter and LinkedIn users in the world. Now, these two simple statistics confirm what many of us already knew anecdotally, that the Netherlands is what I can term best in class on many of the different elements that make it a truly open, connected global economy. Hence, as we collectively continue to try and address the economic markets that has the economic crisis that has gripped market, and especially here in Europe, leadership from countries like the Netherlands to keep markets open and to support the need for more, not less, global cooperation remains absolutely critical. The Netherlands recognize the role of open trade and fair trade as a fundamental pillar of global stability and shared responsibility. For me, as DG of the WTO, global citizenship is a professional reality, a vocational calling. In our ever more interconnected world, global citizenship has to become now a given. Responsible citizenship also, and in many ways, we are in a world where we have a global citizenship, but we do not have a responsible citizenship. And this is where organizations like the NCDO step in to guide public opinion into global responsible citizenship. And we, in a way, in the WTO, play a somehow similar role at a larger level, but with a narrower focus, that of promoting an open, non-discriminatory multilateral trading system through adherence to a set of global rules. Now, let me build on this theme by touching on the three main issues. One, keeping markets open is good citizenship. Two, rules should reflect global realities, although obviously a common vision of this global reality is hard to forge. And three, truly global citizenship systems need inclusiveness. On the first, adhering to trade rules is responsible global citizenship, but it does not happen automatically. A major work of the institution I represent is monitoring, checking, verifying that the trade measures taken by the 153 members of the WTO adhere to the rules that have been established and entered to by these members. And of course, settling disputes peacefully as and when they arise, as they inevitably do. Now, when the global economy grows, this monitoring work rarely reaches headlines or the public eye. However, in an uncertain global economic situation, this technical function starts making headlines. And to use banking jargon, the multilateral trading system is undergoing a stress test. It has so far held up with new trade restrictive measures introduced last year and the years before, covering around 1% of world imports, which overall seems to be a good result in containing protectionist pressures. And in doing so, the multilateral trading system, the WTO, has proved its worth as an insurance policy against protectionism. But the tensions are still there, and they are growing. And my sense is that another stress test is in view for the times to come. New economic outlooks for this year suggest global economic activity is slowing, economic performance is uneven, debt levels are rising, there still is significant financial volatility in the system, unemployment persists as unacceptably high levels in many OECD countries, and as you well know here, economic confidence in Europe is, to say the least, shaky. Unilateral actions to shield domestic industries, although sometimes appealing from a narrow short-term perspective, will not solve global problems. On the contrary, if that was to happen, it will make things worse by triggering a spiral of tit-for-tat reactions in which every country will lose. As Gandhi used to say, eye for eye, and we all will be blind. Such developments threaten adding to the downside risk to the global economy and wiping out any short-term possible eventual gains from protectionist measures. And of course, the risks of protectionism are even greater for small countries. Regional and global markets offer opportunities to overgrow the constraints of small national markets. Dutch companies in the Fortune 500 are steeped in national business ethic, but most of their business, most of their growth is outside this country. And this is why, historically, the Netherlands has invested in global trade and reaped the reward. And it continues to invest. What more impressive statement of faith in the global economy than this Port of Rotterdam Maas-Klausler port development. And as my Dutch colleagues, and we have a few in WTO, are keen to remind me this old proverb that God made the earth, but the Dutch made Holland. On my second point, I recognize that NCDO's advocacy on international development cooperation taps into this long tradition of Dutch concern with global social justice issues. When a Dutch NGO, Solidaridad, launched its first fair trade products in 1988, they used the title of a novel published some 130 years earlier to brand their products. And this fictional character, Max Havelaar, is now an economic fact, and fair trade brands are now a mainstream product with a growing market share. Now, fair trade is one market-based solution to inequality. Another is for trading partners to base their actions on the globally agreed rules and the development dimension of these rules. Trade opening, as we all know, can have a profoundly transformational effect on a country's economy, and we have seen many examples of this in the WTO ledger, from Angola to Zambia and many others in between A and Z. At last December's ministerial conference, the WTO accession process of Russia, Montenegro, Samoa were completed, ensuring, and we've already heard this morning, that the WTO now covers 97% of world trade. Which brings me to my point regarding rules reflecting reality. Adapting multilateral rules to the realities of a fast-changing global economy, global community, is indeed challenging. We see this in the Doha development round. In fact, we've reached an impasse in the negotiation, which I think is a reality which is now recognized by all. And in my opinion, the present deadlock boils down to a fundamental political question, which is the following. What is the right balance of trade-related rights, commitments, obligations between countries at different levels of development? And of course, we know that the emergence of powerful developing countries reshuffles this old game of power and wealth in the north and weakness and poverty in the south. Now, what's the right new balance that has to be struck internationally is, of course, understandably, a difficult negotiation. It has to result in a new compromise. And those of you who will be more versed in climate change negotiations will recognize a pattern which, about climate negotiations, is very similar to what's happening or not happening in global trade negotiations. Now, this is the geopolitical reality of the day, and one of the central questions which we, as a global community, have to face. Now, as DG of the WTO, my job is not to take sides. My job is not to decide whether emerging countries are poor countries with many rich people or rich countries with many poor people. This is for our members to decide. But I have to try and help them find a way out of this corner, and I'll continue to do that by seeking some sort of convergence, starting, of course, which I think is a well-known approach here in Netherlands, starting from the facts and a proper assessment of the realities of the multilateral trading system of today. Let me now turn to my final theme. We all know that the Netherlands have always been one of the most important transaction grounds for international trade. A whole range of different products go through Dutch ports, exchanges, factories every day. This is a bewildering complexity of different transactions. And this complexity is growing and challenging the way in which we track trade flows. In today's international trade, most of world trade is in intermediate products. Supply chains extend globally with production steps carried out across different countries with semi-finished products, components, parts, traveling along the production chain between different countries. And this, of course, challenges the traditional concept of a product as being made in country X or Y. Can we say where the iPhone is really made? Well, my iPhone is labeled made in China. But parts of this little machine come from Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, US, Europe, and elsewhere. In fact, from more than 15 countries. And what about the value of the design and branding, which brings together an even more geographically disparate range of actors? And I think this iPhone, iPad examples highlights the ever-increasing complexity of international economy and exchange. The same can be seen with what has been commonly termed as an American car, where the components and services are provided in economies as large as Germany, Japan, or as small as Barbados. Or let's look at the European Airbus, which is produced in 44 countries, among which 21 are not on the European continent. Now, many factors are behind this process, such as huge improvements in transportation, communication, led by technological transformation, better infrastructure, increasingly efficient logistics have helped to reduce trade costs and keep them low, thus contributing, fostering this creation of global production networks where countries in industries specialized not in products, but in tasks. And indeed, once more, the Netherlands has been at the forefront of many of these changes. Only think about this well-known example of the impressive logistics behind global horticulture supply chains. So the challenge from a development perspective is ensuring that this is an inclusive process, one which also raises the living standards of the world's poorest countries. And in many ways, these global supply chains offer better opportunities for developing countries. Remember the time, and I hope Sri will not object, when in your neighborhood, Malaysia tried during years and years and years to have an integrated car industry. Now, it did not work. But look at where Malaysia now is in these car global supply chain productions, it has extremely well succeeded in penetrating some segments of this global supply chain. In other words, this huge technological progress, which is leading to this new pattern of international trade, reduces the entry ticket of poor developing countries into international trade. And in many ways, this is good news, provided, of course, the necessary conditions are there for them to penetrate the circuits of international trade. Now, some progress has been made, for example, in areas like duty-free, quota-free access for least developed countries, although in some countries work is still left to do. At this last year's ministerial meeting, other decisions were taken in favor of least developed countries in the areas of services, intellectual property, or even accession of LDCs to the WTO. And we now have 15 LDCs waiting to join the organization. So the needs of these poorest countries are now becoming a pressing concern for the organization, but even where such action to support them have been implemented, it has yet not had the desired effect. Least developed countries still account only for 1% of global trade. Now, it's 1% of a global trade that has vastly expanded, but let's recognize that this proportion is still to be addressed. And this is why, since 2005, I have championed the concept of aid for trade. It's one thing to provide poor, least developed countries with better market access, with a better leveling playing field. It's another thing for them to be able to exploit these opportunities. Making trade possible is one thing, making trade happen is another thing. And this is precisely where Aid for Trade comes in, as it seeks to add value to the trade rules solution by addressing the fundamental supply side and trade-related infrastructure constraints of these countries. And we all know that these constraints limit developing and least developed countries' ability to enjoy their improved market access, and as a result of that, the benefit for their population of more trade. Key part of this initiative is about aligning development assistance with the trade-related priorities of developing countries. And this means helping developing countries to understand the linkages between sectoral strategies in, for instance, agriculture, transport, energy, and of course, getting donors to align their support accordingly. And this latter process has, in recent years, been successful. Funding for Aid for Trade grew 60% between 2005 and 2009 to reach $40 billion. And despite the impact of the crisis, we expect support for trade-related development assistance to be maintained. And I'm sure an important actor on the donor side, which is SRI, and an important actor on the recipient side, which is our friend Wabachu, will themselves exemplify how, on both ends of this Aid for Trade initiative, they've been moving forward, and I want to thank both of them publicly for this today. With public budgets squeezed, my own view is that Aid for Trade remains a good investment. Last year, we held a global review of this initiative in Geneva and asked donors and recipients to show results. And the response we got was very encouraging. It showed how Aid for Trade is working at various levels, including examples of where Dutch assistance is obviously making a difference. For instance, through the work of the CBI, or through the support we get from your country in initiatives such as the Standard and Trade Development Facility, which is focused on helping developing countries building the capacity to match sanitary and phytosanitary standards in ag or agriculture-related production. Now, the need to show results for this Aid for Trade investment is one which I wholeheartedly endorse. In my view, the evidence is there. It just needs harvesting better and putting in the right framework. Who could have thought in 1988 that fair trade would have become what it is today? Who can imagine what will result from Dutch investment in Aid for Trade in the future? I feel confident that both ends of Aid for Trade, capacity building, will at the end keep benefiting. It is a clearly win-win process. Remember the Port of Rotterdam development. Investing in Aid for Trade is investing in Dutch prosperity too. We all have an interest that the containers which are handled down there also come from developing and least developed countries. As I conclude, it's clear to me that there are many facets to good global citizenship. Trade is only one of them, but it is an important part of these many facets. And in this sense, keeping markets open is good global citizenship. Ensuring that trade rules reflect changing global realities is certainly a challenging undertaking, but I remain optimistic and committed to a more ambitious outcome. And finally, I believe that Aid for Trade is an investment in the future prosperity of all of us, not just developing countries. Let me commend the Netherlands for your commitment to development assistance, to supporting the use of trade as a tool for growth and poverty reduction. This year and the years ahead, I'm afraid, will remain challenging for many of us. And notably because of that, I urge you to maintain your support for building trade-related capacity in developing countries, especially in least developed countries. Focus, as you know how to do it, on quality aid, on smart aid, on inclusive aid, on what I could call aid for investment. Thank you for your commitment to this endeavor, to trade, to development, to a more global citizenship based on collaboration, community, and thank you for your attention.